And welcome. This may be the most important live stream of your life. The Western world is encountering a lot of chaos right now. Last week, we discussed the paper that showed from a cyclic analysis the political instability patterns we can expect, for how long, and what rippling effects are responsible. Knowing that, we can take this wisdom from the paper and remove a lot of pain and angst and fear from political instability and have some certainty on our ability to deal with it in a more bird's eye view manner, allowing us the detachment necessary to grow beyond it and think critically about it. This week, we will be following up that paper to evaluate its predictions, which turn out to be accurate. And who are we? I'm Ben, a software engineer and the founder of Beverly. I've built software that is installed millions of times each month and created content on YouTube that has a year of view time. I'm joined today by John, an amateur screenwriter and autodidact philosopher who led our recent Viveki series, which is very worthwhile watching. It can change your life. Together, we are part of Beverly, an open company comprised of a study department, which includes this weekly show to uncover an objective truth and align our axioms towards it, and also comprised of the build department, developing products that will further the expansion of collaborative wisdom, which will launch pretty soon. So let's get started with today's stream. So I'm going to be sharing my Google Chrome. So this is a paper we're discussing. The link is in the video description for you to read it and follow along. It is the this one here, the 2010 structural demographic forecast for the 2010-2020 decade, a retrospective assessment. And this one is authored by Peter Turchin and Andrey Korotayev. Sorry, Andrey. Hopefully that's better. But this is a follow-up of this paper, which we did, which was the dynamics of political instability of the United States. And over the past few weeks, we've done several sessions, mostly focusing on propaganda and identity threats. And then now it's political instability. So the last paper made a series of predictions. And you can watch our previous live stream about where we go into details for that. But for this one, they've done a follow-up paper because the last one was written around 2010, and they predicted that in the next decade, from their cyclic analysis, that political instability would increase. And now they're doing an assessment of what did they get right, what did they get wrong, how does it compare with other predictive forces? And it turns out they were pretty on par. Now, to get started, I just want to read this little bit, which is kind of like the value proposition of today's paper. The final comment that we wish to make is that the success of the 2010 SDT, you defined that earlier, I can't remember what it means, forecast offers some hope for our troubled times. The SDT is not merely a theory for understanding why internal violence outbreaks develop and spike, but providing us with the understanding of deep structural causes of socio-political instability and societal breakdown. SDT also gives us a tool for adopting the right set of reforms and policy interventions that can reverse these drivers of instability. So if you make an accurate prediction, then you can then also, so you make a hypothesis, you test that, and one of the ways you test it in social science is you make a prediction. If that prediction is true in a good testing ground of it, then we can have faith that the hypothesis is correct. So in this case, the prediction was true. And now they're thinking, okay, if we take these contributing factors to political instability, maybe going forward, we can actually have government policy or company policy or community policy start to reduce contributing to political instability. So as we can see here, this is in the United States. This is temporal trends in anti-government demonstrations in 5 Western countries between 1946 and 2018. And between 2010 and 2020, anti-government demonstrations just went through the roof, as well as...
It's not just United States, but that's including France and UK in that graph as well.
Yeah, thanks. And here is for in riots. And they've gone into detail in the previous paper about this. So this is now, they've incorporated the data of the last decade. The previous paper left off in 2010 and was a great analysis. So there's things that can actually be done. So earlier on in the paper, they kind of break it down into these are the contributing factors in the system. And so SDT is the structural demographic theory, which is uh, their theory, which they did the hypothesis in the previous paper. They've tested it. So now it graduates from a hypothesis to a theory. And so there's these contributing factors, and then they break down the relationship. So what's the equation? How do we actually get a measurement of political instability? And that measurement ends up giving us a little graph like this. So we can see from the previous paper, they projected things would increase. And this is really interesting because the previous paper, it went into like the last 200 years or so, or I think even longer. So this is just looking at this current wave of a secular cycle, and they defined secular cycle earlier in terms of the two competing parts in this. Let me see if I can find it. Secular. All right.
I don't know if he does it in this paper, but in the last one, it seemed like he was using secular cycle to just mean like the time of peace, where there's low political instability. Yeah.
So I've got it. So furthermore, the PSI. Do we have a definition of the PSI? Okay. So it's another part of the analysis. Focuses on secular waves, long-term oscillations with periods of around 2 to 3 centuries. Yet our historical research has shown that there is an additional process, which is not part of the structural demographic theory, that needs to be taken into account when studying social political stability. A shorter term oscillation with an approximate period of 50 years, which has been dubbed the father and son. So in the last paper, they talked about how there's these periods, these cycles of instability and stability that happens in centuries, but then within, there's also these periods of more minor catastrophes or instability that occurs every 50 years, and they label that the fathers and sons. So I'll read out the abstract, then we'll just go through the highlights. So this article revisits the prediction made in 2010 that the 2010-2020 decade would likely be a period of growing instability in the United States and Western Europe. This prediction was based on a computational model that quantified the USA such structural demographic forces for instability as popular immiseration, intra-elite competition, and state weakness prior to 2010. Using these trends as inputs, the model calculated and projected forward in time the political stress indicator, so there's our PSI acronym, which in the past was strongly correlated with social political instability. Ortmans et al. Conducted a similar structural demographic study for the United Kingdom. Here, we used the cross-national time series data archived from the US, UK, and several major Western European countries to assess these structural demographic predictions. We find that such measures of social political instability as anti-government demonstrations and riots increased dramatically during the 2010-2020 decade in all of these countries. John, do you have anything to add before I go through the highlights?
Nope, that's all right. I'm guessing probably my highlights get included within yours as well, since it looks like you have more than I do. But if I have any, I'll bring them up as we pass them.
Cool. So previous work on this important issue has been conducted largely by political theorists, policy analysts, sociologists, historians, and computational modelers who worked in isolation from each other with focused domain-specific data sources. For a recent review, C3. Separately, they all offer intriguing insights and have produced important discoveries, but ultimately each can provide only one piece of a puzzle. Structural demographic theory offers a more holistic framework for investigating such multiple interacting forces that shape long-term social pressures that lead to revolutions, civil wars, and other major outbreaks of social political instability. So what's interesting, at least here, is you have domain-specific stuff, but then you always want to be trying to integrate that with the larger theory. The more that a prediction is tested against more things, then the better a more a theory is tested against more things, then the stronger the theory becomes. And this work to unite it is very similar to the goal of like a peer review study, which is you get a diverse set of interpretations or perspectives to evaluate or criticize something. And then you hopefully draw conclusions that are workable, like this needs improvement, this was right, this could actually incorporate with this other superset of theory, which is actually what Bevery's a lot about, which is collaborative wisdom. How can we get people from isolated wisdom collaborating with each other so things like this happen more often? So the social demographic theory proposes the causes of revolutions and major rebellions are in many ways similar to processes that cause earthquakes. In both revolutions and earthquakes, it is useful to distinguish pressures, structural conditions which build up slowly from triggers, sudden releasing events, which immediately precede a socio-geological eruption. So this is the breakdown of all the different contributing factors. The basis for this forecast was a quantitative model that took its inputs, that as inputs, the major social, is SD still being, they use so many acronyms in this paper. This is my main criticism of this paper. There's too many acronyms. All right.
Yeah, it should be
demographic.
Yeah.
Okay. The major structural demographic drivers for political instability: immiseration, intraelite competition, state incapacity or state capacity, and translated them into political stress indicator, which is strongly correlated with social political instability. The rising curve of the calculated political stress indicator then suggests that a growing future social political instability. All right, so what comprises this political stress indicator? The key output variable in this model is political stress indicator, PSI, or whatever Greek alphabet letter that is.
I think it's phi. I think that's phi. It's just like a placeholder symbol for whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just hopefully continue to use PSI, but I'm not going to go into like N, A, too many acronyms. Stop doing it. All right. Which summarizes the structural demographic pressures for instability, or equivalently, the loss of social resilience of the modeled state. Here, MMP, or mass mobilization potential, captures the effect of growing popular immiseration. EMP, or elite mobilization potential, quantifies as intra-elite competition and conflict, and SFD, state fiscal distress, measures the weakening of the state. In other words, the rate of change of relative elite numbers is the net rate of social mobility. So this is similar to the Gini coefficient, or the GENI coefficient that is used to measure what would you call it, economic success of a country in terms of how often do people migrate from lower class to middle class to upper class. So this is like another type of measurement that's taking into that. So for instance, Australia actually has a higher Gini coefficient than USA. So therefore we are a more equal nation in terms of our economy, which is interesting. And not in terms of equal of everyone is equally poor, but equal in terms of people move. There's less prohibiting factors in the movement up in upper classes. The first one is national debt, scaled in relation to the GDP. The second part measures the degree of trust or distrust that the population and elites have in the state institutions, including its ability to service the debt. So this is the measurement for state fiscal distress, which is interesting because it's not just the elites, but it's also the general population they're measuring. So whether the elites are unsatisfied with the government or the general population is unsatisfied. It's really interesting.
And I think
if you're a
they were just using for that data Pew Research polling for like how much do you trust what's coming out of the Washington's DC government, and it was either like or no, that wasn't the exact question though. The exact question's in there somewhere, but I can find it. Sorry, go ahead with what you were saying.
It's right here. Distrust in government data are taken from the Pew Research Center. Proportion responding some of the time, never to the question, and how much of the time do you trust the government in Washington?
Right. Yeah.
And it's interesting. A lot of this is also measured. They also have measurements for wage, which is fascinating. I think I have more notes going into that later. Furthermore, the political stress indicator, focuses on secular waves, long-term oscillations with periods around 2 to 3 centuries, yet our historical research has shown that there's an additional process which is not part of the structural demographic theory that needs to be taken into account when studying social political instability. The shorter term oscillation with an approximate period of 50 years, which has been dubbed the father and son cycle. So if you want to know more about that, check out the previous stream we did. They operate in all known state level societies. Okay. Maybe I need to include just this previous sentence. First, there is a value in a more parsimonious model, which focuses only on the structural demographic forces. The structural demographic drivers are more fundamental in the prediction of the dynamics of social resilience and its opposite, fragility. They operate in all known state level societies. Unlike the father and son cycles, for example, the Chinese data lack the 50-year cyclic component that the USA has. Additionally, favorable, or maybe the West has, it's not indicated there, but it's not present in the Chinese sampling. Additionally, favorable structural demographic conditions can impress the father and son spikes of violence, as apparently happened for the missing 1820 peak in the US. So this is good because it means that if we create a society or an institution or a telos with like if we can create a community arranged around a telos that has favorable structural demographic conditions, so it has an ethos that is inclusive, a large normativeness. We've talked about this before. So let me stop. Let's go to webcam. So you have telos, which is the goal. You then have the ethos of how the goal is practiced. And how wide that funnel is, like how restrictive the telos is the normativeness. So strict normativity would mean that the ethos is strictly guided, the behaviors are strictly guided by the goal. So what you want in the largest possible organizational structures is to have a normativeness that is really inclusive. But to do that, you also need then a telos and an ethos that then respects subcultures. And be that a subculture being a company like Apple versus Google, or a community of people like, or a religion, things like that. So you want, when you're going for a stable government, is to have structural conditions that are favorable for preventing tribal clashes, where they feel like they're heard, they feel the process is fair, they feel like they can operate within destroying it. So this is really cool. This is a good thing for the future. Like it can actually be managed providing you work hard on managing it.
Right. And that's kind of like the whole like central like reason, or not reasoning, but motivation I think behind both this paper and the one before is actually attempting to figure out what is it that causes political instability within nations to where we have these violent riots and things like that are occurring regularly. And then what are the factors that prevent that from happening? And so like doing what we can to sort of like produce those factors so that you can ideally have peace without having these sorts of large spikes in political instability and so on.
Right. All right, let's go back to it. Alrighty. So the calculated PSI for 1958 to 2011 and the forecasted PSI, right? So that's what the prediction guarantee, the theory incorporated with the known data in 2010. I think they wrote the previous paper in 2012. That's why it stops there. And then what they predicted it would become. So pretty accurate, and they go into it. So what did our analysis show, and how well did it stand up? So we focus on two variables, riots and anti-government demonstrations. We focus on these two variables because other indices of instability in CNTS, whatever that acronym is, such as major government crises, purges, and revolutions, are rare or not present in mature Western democracies, and thus do not provide enough data for robust statistical characterization of temporal trends. So this is interesting, right? So a Western democracy has these favorable structural demographic conditions where they effectively remove the need for major government crises, purges, and revolutions. However, in the previous paper, they talked about this where the whole complete cycle, that the secular cycle, also depends on a democracy that where the elites are willing to sacrifice their power. if they have incentives to hold on to the power, then everything continues to get worse. So, however, compared to other forms of government besides a democracy or previous forms, there's many experimental ones that are being proposed. Such as dictatorship, feudalism, a lot where we see these huge things, then a democracy can ease that by making sure that the political turnover happens more peacefully. So these things no longer become a symptom in a actual symptom, they just become a hypothetical because they're not actually required to provide stabilization again. Alrighty, so the results, both anti-government demonstrations and riots exhibit similar temporal dynamics. A spike during the late 1960s, followed by a low instability regime until 2010, and then another spike after 2010. However, while violent riots tend to dominate the 1960 spike, peaceful demonstrations are 5 times more frequent than violent riots after 2010. So this is interesting. So we have anti-government demonstrations green and riots in dark red. So we can see actually in the USA, peaceful is always higher, but we also see riots do lag. They do follow the amount of anti-government demonstrations as well.
Well,
However,
just pointing out that like during the 1960s, during the sort of Vietnam sort of protests that were going on, a lot of those were either violent riots or just the regular anti-government sort of peaceful riots. But as of late, there's been a ton more just peaceful riots, or it's not peaceful riots, but peaceful protests that are going on. Like I'm sure this would count like the Women's March and different things like that. So that's like a regular thing that's happening now, and it's a peaceful protest that's occurring. And while there is sort of still the spike in violent riots that are going on. As of late, yeah, just the amount of non-violent protests that are going on is just quite a bit more than we've had before, at least within the past 100 years.
Yeah. And what's interesting is if you compare that actually to the UK, they have had times when riots between 1980 and I guess 1985 far exceeded peaceful protests, which is really interesting. And we saw that same trend actually occurring up until 2012 in the UK, but then peaceful ended up reclaiming. So the UK has this, more violent way of expressing itself, it seems, which is that would be interesting to find out what the fundamental analysis of that is. Because those are things you can start learning from and start applying different policy. So in the United Kingdom, the pre-2010 dynamics differ from those in the USA in that the previous peak of instability occurs later, during the early 1980s, and is not prominent in the late 1960s peak in the USA. However, the rise in both riots and demonstrations after 2010 mirrors closely the USA pattern. Additionally, we see the same shift from more violent to less violent forms of protest. During the early 1980s, riots were about 2 times as frequent as demonstrations, while during the 2010s, demonstrations were much more frequent than riots. I'm just imagining Jordan Peterson just, doing this dialogue that made him famous earlier, where it's just like, the point of speech is so you don't have to have violence. You have violence through your words, which kill personas rather than people, and people can always reinvent their personas. So it's kind of interesting. It'll be fascinating to find out what analysis about that difference provides and insights. So the most, and this is fantastic.
Yeah, I love this.
We've talked about Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, before on this channel, and I was highly critical of that. Not just me personally, I just felt his arguments were hopeless. And we went into that in that stream. And again, Steven Pinker seems to be wrong. So the most outspoken was Steven Pinker, who in The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, research and written during the noughties.
Hold on, because the interesting thing about this prediction made by the paper is the fact that given the trends previously, there was expected to be more peace. And so they're sort of going against the sort of consensus of the time to say that, no, these next 10 years are going to be much, there's going to be a rise in political instability. And so there's other people such as like Steven Pinker, who was making the case that, oh, we sort of like, we've conquered violence for the within the Western countries, and so now we don't have to worry so much because things are looking much better. Things are always just going to keep on going up, and so it's pretty funny to see how this guy Peter Turchin's vindicated, and Steven Pinker is sort of taken down a peg or two. Yeah.
Right. It's very similar to when we did Blank Slate, and then a while after it, we did the A Natural History of Rape. And then it's like one takes a way grander analysis and makes really good predictions, and then the other one seems is the other one. All right. Yeah. And published in 2011, argued that violence in the world has declined both in the long run and in the short run. The past decade has demonstrated that this assessment was wrong. When we look at a decadal timescale and a particular kind of violence, collective violence within states, this focuses on intrastate collective violence, while leaving personal violence, e.g. homicide and interstate warfare for another analyses, is determined by the main variable that the structural demographic theory focuses on explaining. First, historical analysis shows that peaceful periods lasting 1 or 2 generations, 25 to 50 years, are very common in history. They tend to occur during the integrative phases of structural demographic cycles. They are invariably, at least in all historical cases that have been studied in detail so far, succeeded by disintegrative phases, characterized by surging collective violence, state breakdown, and recurrent civil war. This is such a great insight for this. Like it sounds intuitive, but to actually be able to take an intuition and actually throw it against the world and test it and measure it, that's one hell of a thing to do. So, and we see this like with, I've experienced this with communities versus companies. In a community, this constant battle over what the telos of the community should be. Whereas a company, the telos is dictated by the leadership, and then it provides a normative behavior for those within it. So companies can build things where communities really struggle to build, which is why we're investing in companies rather than necessary communities. So like, for instance, our computer that we're talking on right now was made by companies, not communities, just purely because you can break these things down into it. But at the same time, companies that also seem to have some type of community vibe, which is where they do allow a fairness of process for revision, also fare better. Like there's a whole analysis to be done about what causes companies to fail and what causes them to continue. And Apple invested a lot of research into that. So alrighty. Yeah, we've covered that. Alrighty. At the same time, rival theories are not supported. For example, the crude Malthusian explanation, which connects popular immiseration to social breakdown, fails to account both for the start and end of the time of troubles. Many of the historical golden ages were the golden ages only for the elites, whose high levels of consumption were based on low real wages and falling consumption levels of the great majority of the population. Furthermore, while declining living standards are often a contributing factor to the social pressures of instability, reversing this trend does not end instability until elite overproduction is also reversed. More details in chapter 10. So such future-looking predictions cannot be the sole way to test theories of social microdynamics, such as the structural demographic theory. Manipulative experiments in such disciplines are not possible for both ethical and practical reasons. So it'd be great to just collect 1,000 people and then just be like, this is your new government. Let's measure how that succeeds, right? Which is why you see like some of the greatest psychological experiments happening before like what, the 1970s, when ethics of psychological experiments came in. scientific ethics actually matured, because otherwise you have things like the Milton experiments and all sorts of horrific experiments that really potentially cause harm to the participants.
Right,
However,
like the Stanford prison experiments. That's
right.
That's a pretty interesting one too.
Yeah, and then you have but however, there is actually an opportunity for this. It's actually called seasteading, which is a kind of experimenting in international waters with alternative government. This seems fantastic. So similar to what some Americans are trying to do with Chaz, where they forcefully take over a district and then claim it as a company, which for the UN to actually recognize a country as recognize a new country, one of the requirements is it must have been obtained peacefully. So Chaz are going to have a hard time getting the new country that they seized from military force, uh, uh, what do you call it, recognized.
Right.
However, there seems to be a lot of rule breaking in modern politics, which is part of the problem that causes instability. So the alternative is what's happening with a country called Liberland, where this is a country that is peacefully acquired, and they've got diplomats all across the world to do the final part of international recognition. But an alternative to this, like Liberland is just the libertarian country that they're wanting, and they've got hundreds of diplomats now across the world. Now, the alternative is seasteading, which is you have these little micro cities, which will function as micronations in international waters, where everyone gets to test their ideas of government consensually. This is something fantastic, because if things like this promote, then we can really find out, hey, is republicanism better? Is progressivism better? Is libertarianism better? Or even at a way smaller scale, just experimenting with even social taboos. For instance, I heard from Jacob Apple, I think Applebaum is his name. Yeah, Jacob. No, that's not it. The guy who wrote The Man Who Wouldn't Stand Up. He has actually a Reason TV interview where he talks, where he questions certain things like, say, pedophilia and bestiality, and I've got another whole bunch of arguments against pedophilia, because some people like Camille Paglia are for pedophilia, which is horrendous, as well as many individualists. This is the difference between an individualist and a libertarian, which is pedophilia. The reason why it's bad is that it obstructs the obtainment of liberty for the manipulated child. When a libertarian has a responsibility beyond an individualist to promote liberty in their peers, especially their children. There's a social obligation towards liberty. But in terms of bestiality, his argument was fascinating, which was it's a horrendous imagery. But then he said there is documented cases where it seems that the animal was consensual. And how do you manage consent in an animal? Now, from veganism, you view what they do. If they're screaming, they're probably not going to be happy. But same thing, we know this with our dogs. Like, we develop relationships and we can start to understand and empathize with our dog's desires. So he gave the instance where for bestiality, there's certain cases where it seems consensual, which is interesting, because then the argument against it no longer starts being about liberty. It becomes, well, what is best for the nation? If we roll out or provide this practice, is that best for the nation? And one of those other discussions then is, like, say, drugs, which is if you have public health care and people take drugs, then it's on the whole society to provide treatment options when those drugs go awry. It's the taxpayer's responsibility. So a lot of the reason why drugs are illegal is because it forgoes the need for the public taxpayer to pay for treatment of other people, which is this desire to move towards health. Or you do what they've done with cigarettes, or the USA has done with marijuana, which is you tax it incredibly highly, which is a way of working around that. You have public health care and you can work around that. All righty. So seasteading, fantastic idea. If there was seasteading, hopefully we wouldn't see things like what's happening in Hong Kong. The importance of sovereignty and self-governance is one of the things to fight for in the next few centuries. Alrighty. Uh, yeah. So the primary way of testing theories in historical dynamics is retrodiction. Retrodiction is the prediction about the past. So you get historical analysis, you then break it down, and then make sure your predictions worked previously. This is a lot what stock trading does. Stock trading, you're making predictions of the future, but you can't get a time machine and test it. You have to look back, and then you constantly revise your algorithms to make sure that the future predictions are more and more accurate, because you're always getting more knowledge about the past because the present becomes the past. So structural demographic theory is concerned with social trends that develop slowly on the scale of many years and decades. Thus, the 2010 forecast did not focus on any specific year, but rather on the whole decade. Furthermore, none of the fundamental structural demographic drivers have been reversed so far. Thus, the American social system continues to be very vulnerable to additional quakes. It is important to note that so that's fascinating. He'll go into this in more detail later. But a little side note, a tangent, is it is important to note that disease outbreaks occur much more frequently during the crisis periods. Such epidemics historically have had disproportionate effect on the less advantaged segments of the population. The COVID-19 pandemic was not an exception to this macro historical pattern. What this means in terms of structural demographic theory is that the pandemic has further worsened the well-being of large swaths of the American population and consequently drove up the mass mobilization potential. Furthermore, the governmental dysfunction in dealing with the pandemic, coupled with intra-elite infighting, will likely further depress the already low levels of trust in government institutions. Thus, the effect of the shock discovered by coronavirus has been to further destabilize the American polity. So this is fascinating. Like, why is the BLM protest magnificent now in this year, right? Well, we covered in an earlier beverage stream a few weeks ago what happens when our identity is threatened, another great live stream. And in it, it talks about unless your identity is threatened, then you will develop homeostasis with the cultural expectations. You'll normalize yourself to fit within, because identity, like changing your axioms or reinventing yourself from cognitive dissonance is something that affects your fitting in with the culture that you exist within. So what happens when people radicalize is generally they get fed a lot like of arguments or circumstances, trauma or whatever in their life, but they won't act or radicalize on it until something pushes them over the edge. So we can see that, like, say for BLM, like they talk about how this problem has existed over decades in the USA, but now it's getting crazy. Well, it seems the reason why is because you add on an economic recession, you add on social, a whole lot of pandemic issues on top of that, and it specifically hurts the lower classes the most. Then it causes a mass need to fix your identity, and to have the society affected. It causes a social dissonance rather than just a individual psychological dissonance. So this is what he's talking about, where you add more and more pressures, like for an earthquake, you add more and more pressures, and it's going to continue to cause quakes or shocks, aftershocks.
Right.
And that's pretty much the paper. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. One of the things I really appreciated from it is the fact that he sort of lays out his whole basis for creating the formula for the PSI. And so, like, if you have the data, you can plug it in for any sort of nation or country that you want, and then figure out, oh, this is the PSI for, I don't know, Norway, or this is the PSI for Denmark, or something like that. And all of the data that's what I appreciate is it's not like using sort of these vagary things that you can sort of change the goalpost. You can't really move the goalpost, because he's actually like giving you exactly the type of data you would need to plug in, and then that's what gives you sort of the information that you'll need to actually come up with the PSI number. And so, yeah, it's something I wanted to do. I don't know if I have the technical skills to do so, but was just to see using that formula that he gave, and then like what information I could find from some country, and just plug it in to see like, oh, what's the PSI of China, or something like that. Of course, yeah, you probably couldn't use Chinese data, but some other country or something like that. It'd be a fun little experiment to work with. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, we had that previous live stream about is the Second Amendment, so freedom of speech, obsolete? And in it, the author took a great deal of interest in how China deals with
that's the First Amendment. The Second Amendment is your right to bear arms.
Yeah. The Aussie stands always corrected on USA politics. But the for that he talked about it where we think of China as a censor state, but that wasn't actually the main way they deal with it. The main way they deal with it is they just overwhelm the information that the public receives with things that are pro-China. So it's just, there is an abundance of information. So let's just completely saturate some distinct ideas which are pro-China ones to drown out the others. And I had a conversation earlier with someone else where I said, you know, one of the points of Beverly is to make sharing of ideas easier. And they said, well, there's this abundance of ideas, it's actually easier, but it's not that, it's the sharing of distinct ideas. Because right now we have not that many distinct ideas. That isn't that much collaboration on distinct ideas. It's just some ideas get huge traction and then they just overwhelm everything with just more and more noise. So signal is where there is distinct ideas. And so that's that point. The other point to add on to what you say is the Heritage Foundation, they're a think tank, economic and political think tank in the USA. They released, they do this every single year, which is the Index of Economic Freedom. So you can find out which countries are actually the best for providing economic freedom. What is interesting is USA doesn't score that highly on economic freedom, which was a nice humbling thing for many people, I think, to find out. And Hong Kong used to be really high. This year it lost 1.1 points. So while there is still a lot of political instability, it still retains a lot of economic freedom. So it'd actually be interesting if the authors of these two analyses then found out how does political instability influence or correlate with economic freedom, the index of economic freedom. That would be fascinating. So for instance, if we have a country that is high on economic freedom, but then you inject, like what is the PSI for Hong Kong? It's probably really high right now, right? So then we could find out, hey, if PSI increases, economic freedom also goes down. So it's really fascinating. And there's so much amazing implications for this. So they talk a lot about, you know, how they are different, how they're stacking up. Let's see, where's USA? Find your country. United States. Oh, why did they do it? Okay, John, as an American, why do they just say US, the US, or United States? There's many United States, I'm sure, around the world. Like any country which has states are a United States, right? The only thing about the United States of America is that it's of America, it's United States. So when they do that, it's a little bit self-important, I think.
Well, it's kind of like, I mean, there's plenty of suns out there in the galaxy, in the universe, but we only refer to ours, Sol, as the sun. It's the same thing. If you have the most important one, then you're just, that's the United States, and everything else is just the of Mexico or whatever, wherever you, the other United States. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The most important one ranking currently at 17 in economic freedom with an overall score of 76. So
I was kind of surprised. Like, yeah, I'd be interested in like what the different criteria is, because I was suspecting that maybe it's just, well, at first I was suspecting that it was like low tax rate, but I saw Canada was there at like number 8 or so, and I wonder if it also has to do with, say, the sort of social safety nets that are there, which I know the U.S. doesn't have nearly as many as Canada does, despite, but Canada also does have a higher tax rate, I think, than the U.S., but not exactly sure. I just know. I just hear from Canadians that they're always complaining about how much taxes they have to pay.
Yeah, I actually pronounced this wrong. It's a Guinea, not Guinea. It's
Are you sure?
Gini. Yeah.
Well,
I guess so. I mean, it's the same.
no, it's
like,
Ginny. Oh yeah, Gini. Yeah, Gini coefficient.
Oh, Gini. All right.
Yeah.
So they don't pronounce it the way it's spelled. Like quinoa. Like, sorry, it's quinoa. Alrighty. So here, where's the listing? Come on. Man, my computer's chunking. Alrighty. So there is a listing somewhere on Wikipedia where you can find it through different countries and everything. Yeah, but we can see here that Australia and stuff is higher and a few than the USA. So it's kind of interesting. Or whichever one is better. I mean, I don't know whether a high one is better or a low one is better. But yeah, this would be fascinating, like for the author of this to be able to team up with one of these think tanks that have a tremendous amount of data and develop a website like this. This would make a lot of decisions, like such as immigration or such as, because a large point or an essential point of a stable society is it's stable, and it being stable allows you to invest and plan for the future. If it is disable, then the only thing that matters is your immediate survival. So the only reason, like, say, we can hold this is because there is a whole large amount of stability around the world that governments and companies and communities are all and individuals are all working together to maintain. So it would be fascinating. Like, one example would be using political instability to measure currencies. Oh, that would be cool, right? So if you're a currency trader, does PSI actually determine the worth, or sorry, the relationship with the currency value? That would be really cool. So other than that, we covered all the main points on this one. Anything else you want to add?
No, like I said, as you're going through your notes, you had highlighted the exact same stuff I did, so you're able to go through those as well. So,
right. Alrighty, well, we'll end it there. Join us again next week. Next week, we're actually going to be doing an interview. It'll be fantastic. Really, really excited about that. And yeah, join us every week. All the details are in the description below. And yeah, thanks so much for joining.
Yep. I think we're planning on, or did you already end it?
No.
Okay, yeah. I think we're planning on going over the Unabomber's manifesto by Ted Kaczynski. Yeah, so that'll be interesting. Since
yeah, we've been on fire with the recent content. It's been really good. Alrighty, let's change that one to the join us again next week. Alrighty, thanks so much everyone for joining.